Trump's tariff empire is crumbling, and it isn't falling from one direction. It's collapsing from every side at once. China is opening investigations. The EU is breaking free. American businesses are suing their own government for $130 billion. And in the border towns that once thrived on Canadian tourists, the storefronts are going dark, one by one. Welcome to Flashpoint, where power shifts before the headlines catch up. To understand what is happening this week, you need to understand the architecture Trump built and why it is now fracturing at every joint simultaneously. For the past year, the Trump administration ran its trade strategy on a single assumption, that American economic size gave Washington the power to impose costs on trading partners without paying a comparable price at home. Tariffs on Canada, tariffs on China, tariffs on the EU, tariffs on 60 countries under Section 301. The assumption was that America could absorb the friction and its partners could not. That assumption is being tested in real time this week, and the results are not what Washington projected. The first crack appeared in the courtroom. A federal judge has ruled that the U.S. government must begin paying out more than $130 billion in tariff refunds to American businesses. Not to foreign governments, not to trading partners, to American companies, the same companies the tariffs were supposed to protect. More than 2,000 firms have filed lawsuits seeking compensation, including household names like Costco and FedEx. The U.S. Customs Agency is now finalizing a 4-step process to allow importers to electronically file claims and receive refunds. That process is an acknowledgement that the tariffs were illegal, that American businesses paid a tax they were never supposed to pay, and that the bill for that mistake now belongs to the U.S. Treasury, $130 billion, flowing out of Washington, back to the companies that paid it. The tariff revenue that was supposed to fund Trump's agenda is being clawed back by the courts before it can be spent. The legal foundation for this collapse was laid on February 20th, when the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act does not authorize the president to impose tariffs. The ruling was unambiguous. The court found that emergency statute language cannot carry the weight of the largest unilateral tariff regime in American history. Trump's most powerful trade weapon, the one that let him impose any tariff rate on any country instantly, was declared illegal by his own Supreme Court, including justices he appointed. The refund process now underway is the direct financial consequence of that ruling. Every dollar flowing back to Costco and FedEx is a dollar that the tariff strategy cost the American Treasury. Trump replaced the struck-down tariffs with a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, a provision designed for a fixed exchange rate system that stopped existing in 1971. Those tariffs are capped at 15%. They expire after 150 days. The clock is running, and the administration is pursuing Section 301 investigations against 60 countries to build longer-term tariff authority. But those investigations take months to produce results and are already generating backlash across 3 continents. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is how the pressure is now coming back at Washington from directions it never anticipated. China moved on Friday. Beijing opened 2 investigations into U.S. trade practices, a direct mirror of the Section 301 investigations Washington launched against 60 countries earlier this month. The timing is not coincidental. China is setting the stage for a meeting between Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping in May, and it is arriving at that meeting with its own investigations, its own legal framework, and its own leverage. The country Trump has spent years trying to pressure through tariffs is now running the same playbook back at Washington, and doing so with the explicit goal of shaping the terms of a May summit on its own terms, rather than America's. The EU moved this week in a different direction, but one that is equally significant for American economic power. The European Parliament voted to advance the US-EU trade deal, resuming ratification of a framework agreement the 2 sides reached last year. The EU had paused adoption of the deal after the Supreme Court invalidated Trump's sweeping tariffs and after Trump threatened to annex Greenland. Now the EU is moving again, but moving on its own timeline, on its own terms, and after having spent months building alternative trade architecture with the CPTPP nations in Cameroon. The EU is not returning to Washington as a supplicant. It is returning as a bloc that has spent the pause building leverage it did not have before. Meanwhile, something quieter and more permanent is happening in the towns along the American side of the Canadian border. And this story does not show up in court filings or parliamentary votes. It shows up in empty parking lots and closed storefronts and hotel registers that used to be full. Lewiston, New York, a small town 20 minutes north of Niagara Falls. Bakery owner Amy Logren is putting the finishing touches on a retirement cake for a local state trooper. It should be a busy Saturday. It isn't. Canadian tourists, the visitors who used to fill Lewiston's strip of cafes and antique shops and restaurants, have stopped coming. Logren's revenues are down 30%. As a single mother, she describes it simply: it's very tough. Judy, a 73-year-old co-owner of an antique shop in the same strip, has watched sales drop 20%. She is angry that Canadians don't want to come anymore. And then she says something that captures the mood of an entire region with devastating precision. I don't blame them. This is what Trump's tariff war looks like from the American side of the border, not in Treasury spreadsheets, not in diplomatic communiques, in a bakery owner cutting her household budget, in an antique shop losing a fifth of its revenue, in a hotelier hiring fewer staff because the Canadian guests who used to fill his rooms on Bills game weekends are no longer crossing the bridge. The numbers behind these stories are stark. There was a 21% drop in Canadians entering New York State in 2025, more than 3 million fewer visits than the previous year. Personal vehicle crossings in the Buffalo-Niagara Falls area alone declined by 16.3%, a drop of 717,118 crossings in a single year. The fashion outlets mall in Niagara Falls, which expanded specifically to serve Canadian shoppers whose cars used to fill its parking lot with Ontario license plates, is now seeing boarded-up stores. Local hotelier Frank Strangio warns that if the mall, a cornerstone of the local tax base, shuts down, the effect cascades through every public service the town depends on: police, fire, roads, sidewalks. A recent poll by the Globe and Mail found that only 9% of Canadians now consider the United States a trustworthy ally. 9%. And 51% of those polled had canceled American trips in direct response to Trump's comments and tariffs. John Percy, chief executive of Destination Niagara, the regional tourism agency, has made the painful decision to stop advertising to Canadians entirely, redirecting limited marketing dollars toward Americans from other states because the Canadian market has effectively gone dark. I've never seen patriotism from that market in such a short amount of time, Percy said, and rightly so. The Canadians who are still crossing the border are doing so quietly. Percy describes visitors who will not tell their neighbors or family that they came to the U.S. They cross in secret. They hide. The relationship between two countries that shared an unfortified border for over a century, celebrated on a plaque at Lewiston's Peace Park as a lesson of peace to all nations, has deteriorated to the point where crossing the bridge feels like a political statement. Niagara Falls Mayor Robert Restaino says he winced every time Trump called Carney a future governor of a future 51st state. He saw no upside in the annexation rhetoric, no diplomatic return, no economic benefit, just damage, compounding, daily, permanent damage to a relationship that his region depended on. At some point, our federal government has to humbly recognize that misstep, Restaino said. I don't know that that's possible in this current dynamic. Even a 59-year-old Trump voter in Lewiston, Kathleen Stefik, is done with the Canada rhetoric. She supports some of Trump's policies. But on the treatment of Canada, she is unambiguous. What a jerk. Shut up, just stop. Be a president, act like a president. That is the sound of a trade war turning on itself, not in a foreign capital, in a border town in upstate New York, from someone who voted for the man running the war. Scenario 1. The $130 billion refund process moves forward smoothly. Section 122 tariffs expire in July without congressional extension. The May Trump-Xi meeting produces a framework that de-escalates U.S.-China trade tensions. The EU trade deal advances toward full ratification. Canadian tourism to border towns begins a slow recovery as rhetoric cools. The damage to Niagara, Lewiston, and dozens of similar border communities is real and lasting. Years of lost market share that Percy warns takes years to rebuild, but the trajectory stabilizes. The tariff empire doesn't collapse. It quietly retreats. Scenario 2. The refund process generates legal and bureaucratic chaos, as 2,000 companies compete for $130 billion in claims. Section 301 investigations produce findings that trigger new tariffs before the July Section 122 expiry, maintaining pressure on trading partners but escalating retaliation. China's investigations produce counter-findings that complicate the May summit. The EU advances its trade deal but uses it as leverage rather than resolution, demanding concessions Washington is unwilling to make. Canadian tourism to border towns continues to decline through the summer. The human cost in Niagara, Buffalo, and every border-dependent community compounds. Washington is fighting legal battles, refund claims, Chinese investigations, and an EU negotiation simultaneously, with no functioning broad tariff authority after July. Scenario 3. The May Trump-Xi meeting fails to produce agreement. China's investigations produce tariff findings that trigger a full escalation of U.S.-China trade conflict. The EU pauses its trade deal ratification again in response to new American tariffs under Section 301. The 150-day Section 122 clock expires without congressional extension, eliminating Washington's only broad tariff authority. The CUSMA review in July arrives with Trump holding no functioning tariff mechanism, a $130 billion refund liability draining the Treasury, Chinese counter-investigations active, EU relations stalled, and Canadian border towns that have restructured their entire tourism strategies around the assumption that Canadian visitors are gone permanently. The tariff empire does not retreat, it collapses. and the communities that paid the price for building it are on both sides of the border. Trump's tariff empire is crumbling. China is running its own investigations. The EU is advancing on its own terms. A federal court is ordering $130 billion in refunds to American businesses. And in Lewiston, New York, a bakery owner is cutting her household budget because the Canadians who used to cross the bridge on Saturday mornings have stopped coming. Watch whether the $130 billion refund process triggers further legal challenges. Watch what comes out of the May Trump-Xi summit. Watch whether the EU trade deal ratification advances or stalls again. And watch the border crossing numbers, because every month they stay down is another month of permanent market share loss that Niagara's tourism chief warns takes years to rebuild. Subscribe to Flashpoint and hit the bell, because in this world, the next move never waits.